welcome everybody. My name is Nate Barbettini. I'm with Arcade.dev, and I'm super excited today to talk with some really smart folks about MCP and specifically authentication, authorization in MCP, which has been a really hot topic lately. We're here with some excellent folks to break that down and talk about why do we need that, why is it changing, what are kind of some of the intricacies of that, how to think about building MCP servers that have auth. So without further ado, I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves and we'll get into the meat of this technical discussion. So I'm Nate. I'm one of the founders here at Arcade.dev. Previously, I worked at a startup called Cobbler, which was my own startup. Before that, I was at Okta working on developer security. Kick it over to Den to let him introduce himself.
Great. Thank you so much, folks, for having me. I am Den Delimarsky. I'm a product manager at Microsoft, and I work on developer tools.
And Wils.
Hey, everybody. My name is Wils Dawson. I'm also at Arcade.dev with Nate. And my identity security origin story is also through Okta, where I spent about 8 years. And have been floating around through other companies, Kong and Grok, connective tissue for APIs, and now with MCP being a connective tissue for AI, it's really exciting. So good to be here.
I like that auth origin story. That works on like more than one level too. I like that. All right, last but not least, Aaron.
Yeah, hi. I'm Aaron Parecki, Director of Identity Standards at Okta, and longtime contributor to a lot of the OAuth specs. So yeah, my interest here is mainly on the overlap with all the OAuth work that's been done in the MCP world, and currently working on a couple of new forthcoming RFCs in the OAuth world, and yeah, a lot of exciting stuff going on.
Very exciting. All right, so just to kick us off, I think where I want to start is maybe a question for Den. So for somebody who is maybe excited about MCP, I've tried it in Claude. I've been able to get Claude to do some really cool stuff by plugging in an MCP server to Claude or to Cursor. Why are we talking about auth in MCP? It worked fine when I did it on my local machine. So why are we talking about auth for MCP servers?
Before I answer that, should I just say that I feel horribly outnumbered here by Okta people? It's just everybody's mentioning Okta, and I'm like, oh, okay. But no, y'all are awesome.
We'll just federate you on in.
Federate me into the Okta world, please. So, from the perspective auth, it's a question that a lot of folks ask because a lot of the data that MCP servers enable you to connect to, and that can be any data. It can be your Spotify playlists. It can be your enterprise sales numbers. You kind of need a way to connect to that. So for folks that deploy an MCP server either locally or remotely, you need to be able to talk to those protected APIs that gate that data somehow. So there's several ways you can go about that if you build an MCP server. Either you build one that has no auth, and then you just assume that whatever you're exposed to, whether again locally or remotely, is available to everyone that uses the server, or you want to make sure that you don't have any data exposure that you don't want to expose. So especially for enterprise customers, that's critical because you want to make sure that you gate your data behind a set of governance controls. You want to make sure that people that can access the MCP servers are the right people that you intended to, and then you have some level of control of what data goes where. That's where kind of the auth comes in, is because MCP servers require that to be a core component of the spec to be able to implement it the right way.
And to your point about building a server with no auth that just kind of assumes that everything is available, that kind of seems to me where the MCP ecosystem was like a month or two ago. There's a lot of MCP servers on GitHub out there. They're all assumed to be kind of in this local context. They're using standard I/O. They plug into Claude, with running on your local machine, but they haven't really had to tangle with that problem of okay, well, once I put this up in a worker somewhere or a Lambda function, or it's running on the web, now anybody with that URL can access whatever I have in it.
Right. And the scary thing there is that unless there is some kind of standard that sets the bar for the way the flow should work, the way tokens should be exchanged, everybody's going to do their own thing. And that's what we saw, right? As the MCP system or the ecosystem started growing, so did the modalities in which people would pass credentials. Like, oh, use this environment variable or use this like query param that you can pass here, which is, again, if you've worked with any security related stuff, you know how scary that can be because those tokens are going to get logged somewhere, and all of a sudden somebody accidentally checked in the tokens in a GitHub repo. It just doesn't work well. Right. Yeah. So there needs to be some kind of standard that establishes every MCP server should do this consistently, and here's how this is going to go.
Right. When you say angle, I was going to say when you say if there's no standard, then everyone's going to do it a different way. I immediately think back to 15, 20 years ago on the web, which is exactly what you just said. Like everybody did auth differently on the web, and it wasn't until after a long time there were some standards that eventually became widespread that started kind of turning the Wild West back into something that actually could interoperate. So now we're just trying to get ahead of that now, I guess, fix that problem before it becomes a problem.
Well, there's one more angle to it too, which is of course the OAuth angle of even if there was a standard for how to do password authentication, we still have another problem, which is you probably shouldn't be putting in your bank account credentials into these other random pieces of software, which on the 20 years ago was random social network apps would pop up and ask you for your email credentials to log into your email. Now it's random MCP clients asking for your credentials to other servers, which is also a bad plan, even if it was standardized, right?
Go ahead, Aaron.
Go ahead.
I was going to say with this this pattern also is it's not just web scale, it's not just security, it's not just these social network apps and stuff. It's also what I'm hearing is and seeing through the ecosystem and community. It's a lot about going from sort of development to production services. And yes, there's scaling, there's security, there's all of those components that you need to start considering. And an environment variable and using a personal access token from GitHub and plugging that in works on my machine and it works on my cursor and my cloud desktop. But is it going to work for my whole company? Is it going to work at that enterprise scale? Is it going to work across companies and at a web scale? And how do we start to have these standards, think about those things so that we can have production level, enterprise grade, secure and useful services for people.
I think the kind of security and trust is extra paramount here because there's this, the kind of base level of people wanting to make sure these things are secure because of, what we've seen on the web where when it's not secure, bad things happen. Data breach happens, data leaks happen. But then there's this extra, the intensity is just ramped up a little extra bit because now we're in this agentic AI world where some of the actors that might be trying to exploit these resources may actually be not human actors. They might be AI bots that are never, working 24/7 and never sleeping to try to break into your stuff. Or just trusting that if I give AI access to something, some personal information of mine, that it can be trusted with that information. And to Aaron's point, it doesn't say oh, well, just give me the password for your, root password for your Gmail account. And wink, wink, I'm only going to look up the travel receipts in there. I'm not going to go email somebody something else. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So
look, this is the kind of stuff that people miss, right? We're in this new world of MCP. We think it's all brand new. We think it's all this exciting new thing. But the reality is a lot of the security risks we're talking about now have existed for decades. It's the stuff that Aaron can talk more about the whole conceptualization of OAuth and why that's important. But passing credentials directly a username and password into your environment variables, we've seen that before. We know why it's bad. We don't want you to do it.
15 plus years of evidence for why it's bad. So perfect segue to, question for you, Aaron. It seems for all the reasons we just discussed, we want to learn from the mistakes of the past, so to speak, and put a good authorization standard in place for MCP. Why is that OAuth? Why not something else? Why is OAuth the thing we want to add to MCP, and how does that work?
Yeah, well, I was really excited to see that the rev of the MCP spec in March did add OAuth, and I was also personally delighted that it actually referenced OAuth 2.1, which is something I've been working on for a while. And when I saw that, I was like, oh, it makes perfect sense, because it is despite this being new, the MCP and the abilities that you get with AI is all new stuff. The patterns and the relationships of the players are the same. There's third-party software accessing somebody else, some other service's API on behalf of a user. A user is using some software, interacting with that software. That software is going to go get data from another API that is, written by a different company. And that's the exact problem OAuth set out to solve. 20 years ago, it was not AI uses, but it was the same relationships of the players, of a user is using some software, that software wants data from something that is operated by somebody else, and don't want the user to put in their credentials because we don't want that piece of software to have unlimited access. And it's the same thing with AI, right? Like, I don't want the agent to get unlimited access to my email, but I want to be able to grant it some sort of limited access, whether it's read-only or read-only to certain folders or whatever it is. And that's exactly the problem that OAuth solves with how it sets up all the different players.
Adding OAuth to MCP gives us this kind of rich legacy of, like you said, solving these problems 15, 20 years ago for a similar pattern, similar players. You wrote a blog post let me take that back. So you wrote a blog post a month or two ago or less. When was that? It was like weeks ago. It moved really fast.
Moving fast. I think it was 3 weeks ago.
All right, fair enough. So Aaron, you wrote a blog post a couple weeks ago about fixing OAuth in MCP. Can talk us through like what needed to be fixed? Why was the first rev at adding authorization to MCP close but not quite?
Yeah, so like I said, really exciting that the MCP community identified that OAuth was a good solution for this in the first place, because that already was a good baseline to start from. The particular problem with the way they had applied OAuth confused a couple of the roles that you have in an OAuth ecosystem. Mainly it was that if you're building an MCP server, that server itself at that URL had to also be able to issue tokens. So essentially, it like kind of smushed the OAuth server part of it into the MCP server. That's a lot of people. I saw a lot of people writing about how that's going to be really hard for people and developers. It's going to be so hard for everyone to be minting tokens all the time. And that's when it clicked for me, which was like, well, of course, like that's the reason that in OAuth those two roles are split. There's the resource server role and the authorization server role. Now, in practice, you can absolutely build those two things together, and you do see that, especially in large-scale consumer services, right? Like even GitHub, it's just the GitHub API, and you don't really think of it as two separate things. But then you can also have the ability to, because those are two different roles in the protocol, you have the ability to split them up completely physically separate. And that's where you can like grab an off-the-shelf authorization server, whether that's open source or a commercial service, and then you build your API and you just kind of tie it to that thing over the wire, but you don't have to dig into any of the code of making any of the OAuth stuff work, because it's already done. And again, because this MCP stuff is it's the same relationships as we've had before, we should be able to just apply it the same way. So if we can split that apart, and if we can say, here's the MCP authorization server, here's the MCP resource server, and they don't have to be the same machine and the same URL, then we can leverage all of the existing OAuth infrastructure that exists, like open source projects, commercial services that you can plug and play with while you're building your MCP servers.
Yeah, and I think a really important thing to call out, Aaron, is what you were talking about roles. And just like stepping back for those who may not be super familiar with OAuth or even super familiar with the details of MCP, maybe it's worth just a second to talk about like an authorization server is not necessarily what maybe most devs think about as a server. It's actually kind of describing a role. And similarly, like the MCP server is not necessarily one server written in Python or .NET or whatever. It's like a role. It may be one thing, but it may be a collection. Can you speak to that a bit more?
Yeah. This concept of roles is really important for a lot of the OAuth ecosystem. So because you can, once you actually try to apply these in practice, you can actually arrange things in a lot of creative ways. But as long as you map them to the roles, you get to leverage the rest of the ecosystem. So the resource server is a role in OAuth, and the resource server is the thing that the application is trying to get data from. So it doesn't even technically have to be an API, but frankly, most often it's an API. And it doesn't have to be a single server. It could be a bunch of servers. It could be a bunch of microservices. You can have a resource server that's actually built up of hundreds of different smaller parts that all get chained together. But from the OAuth protocol perspective, you would call that whole thing the resource server. So bringing that to MCP, the MCP server is the resource server because it's the thing that the agent is trying to access and get data from. And then you have the authorization server, which is a role, again, because it doesn't matter really where it is arranged, like physically. And its role is to issue tokens that the resource server can validate. And it's responsible for interacting with the user. And I noticed that I did not say it's responsible for authenticating the user because that is something that it can do, but it doesn't technically actually have to. It's possible that an authorization server can issue a token to anybody. Now, it's not likely to happen. Usually there's a user login step, but one of the common ways that the authorization server is not responsible for authenticating users is if it itself is then federated out to another server. And you see this actually very commonly. It sounds complicated, but it's actually really common, especially in business scenarios. Like if I'm using the company Slack, I go download the Slack app on my phone. I click log in. The first thing that does, I don't actually have a password for Slack if it's my company Slack. I get redirected to the company SSO, and I log in there. So Slack does have an authorization server that's issuing tokens to the Slack application, but that authorization server is not actually responsible for getting the user to log in at all. It sends the user out to a separate system to actually have them log in. And again, once we apply this to the MCP world, we just get to, all that stuff just kind of rides along for free, and we get to do all that same stuff without really having to modify what the MCP clients are doing, because again, if we're just using the OAuth as it was designed, we just get to leverage all those existing patterns.
Yeah, and back to the making this easy for devs to actually use. Also, that this also means people building MCP servers don't need a users database. They don't need to store passwords. They don't need to do the authentication bit that you're talking about. And even if they're building their own authorization server and not using an off-the-shelf open source or commercially available one, they still don't need to do that. But they can also obviously use all these commercially available open source authorization servers to not even have to worry about issuing access and refresh tokens in the OAuth world. They can just, as you say, write along for free, which is really powerful.
Yeah, I think that's the core value prop here, right? It's and by the way, massive shout out to Anthropic and a massive, massive community of folks that helped shape this, because that's kind of the goal. Is we know for a fact that a lot of developers, they're not necessarily interested in diving deep in the intricacies of security, because to me, if you're building an MCP server for, I don't know, managing your sales data, you're not necessarily a security expert. You don't want to be a security expert, because it's all I care about is making sure that, people that need to access my sales data can access that sales data. How do I do this properly so it's in a way that is secure, it's governed, my organization has access to it? If your organization uses, whether it's Okta or Entra ID, can I just plug it in and run with it instead of me having to implement it? And I think that's that split between the responsibilities that Aaron was talking about is crucial to enable this, because then as a developer, I know what concerns I need to be worried about, and I know what concerns I can just say, oh, this authorization server here will handle it for me.
It feels like very much like the kind of encapsulation that we always strive for in our code, right? It's I depend on this interface. I don't really care or know how that interface is implemented. I trust that whoever built the implementation of that interface did a good job, but I just care about the interface. And that leaves me the freedom to say, oh, okay, well, assuming that interface works, I'm going to go do the stuff that I care about. I don't have to worry about building both sides of that.
Oh, yeah. And think about it, too. It's a strategy for risk mitigation, because if you were an organization, do you trust that your developers, every single developer that's going to build an MCP server, is going to have the expertise and knowledge to properly know how to mint tokens, how to sign them, how to store them, how to make sure that they rotate them, right? There's a lot of complexity involved. And I'm not saying that developers can do it. They can. But the risk of getting it wrong is very, very high if this is not what you do day in, day out. So would you rather have developers do that? Or would you rather use an established provider or an established open source solution that can just plug and play?
So then you were the leader on the PR to go kind of update the OAuth spec in the MCP protocol the way that Aaron was talking about, and that ended up being way more popular than I expected. It was kind of sleepy for a couple of days, and then suddenly I blinked and there were 300 comments from pretty much everybody who's anybody in the space came out and were talking about it, but proposing ideas. Big shout out to you for even just keeping up with that fire hose of of comments. But one thing that I really noticed was a lot of folks were really excited about this kind of codifying this split and having MCP follow OAuth best practices. But something I saw people getting confused about was now that we're adding auth to MCP, that means I'm super excited because that means that I can auth all my downstream tools. That means I have, Google Auth built in, or I can auth to Slack or Spotify built in. And there was a lot of kind of initial people just kind of going around in circles in the discussion, I think, talking about that, when what you were really trying to bring everybody back to was, we're actually not even talking about that. We're just talking about like client server auth. So how would you describe the difference to someone who might be not even realizing that nuance is important?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, like, you're calling me like the leader. I don't know if that's the right term. Like, I happened to open the PR, but it was all community work. Like, all of you on this call, by the way, like Aaron, Wils, Nate, like, you were like phenomenal in getting like feedback and shaping it. Like, it would, like, it's not me. It's literally like so many awesome people that did that. And I think that to your question, though, like, what the difference is when folks think about connecting specific services, like they think about a scenario in mind. Like, I want my MCP server to, I don't know, analyze my email or summarize my PDFs that are stored in Dropbox or something like that. They think about it in terms of a scenario, and it's like, oh, well, for me to log into Dropbox, I need Dropbox credentials. That's kind of it, right? How do I get the credentials? But there's an interesting part here that sometimes get missed, is that separation of concerns, is that you no longer talk, like, it's not like a desktop or Cursor or Windsurf or VS Code talk directly to Dropbox. They talk through your MCP server. Your MCP server is the conduit to those other APIs. What that means in practice is when Dropbox issues a token, it issues it to a specific client, right? And in this case, the question becomes like, well, who's the token issued to? And what is missed from a lot of this conversation is, again, this wall where I'm the client, Claude Desktop. I'm not the one talking to Dropbox. So I have an MCP server that happens to talk to Dropbox. And what I'm implementing is I am protecting my MCP server. That's that first step. And then the MCP server will talk to Dropbox. So this first hop is what we're talking about here. Is I'm protecting the MCP server. I'm protecting the resource server in kind of the OAuth parlance, and the client is talking to the resource server. So I need to get a token for the MCP server itself, whatever my MCP server is doing. And then it's the responsibility for the MCP server to say, okay, now I know that you're an authorized user. You have a valid token. How do I talk to Dropbox? And this is where that second step comes in. It's like, well, now you need to make sure that you connect your server to Dropbox. And this is, I know that you folks have been looking at that. You have a document. We're not going to do any spoilers here, but that second step is completely separate for, can I access this server to begin with? The question is not, can I access Dropbox? It's, can I access this MCP server that happens to also be talking to Dropbox? Because also you run into scenarios where MCP servers can do a million things. You can have an MCP server that connects to Dropbox, Gmail, Slack. It can start, going directly to OpenAI, and OpenAI requires like API keys and not actually OAuth. You wouldn't be able to just say, oh, for every single one of those requests, I'm going to somehow like have you, the user of OpenAI, authorized to. That makes no sense, right? Like you have to have access to that server, and then have a modality by which that server can expose connections to other services that it might be using. And today it could be 1, tomorrow it could be 5, 10, 20, whatever. So there's a very clear separation of concerns here, and this is where I keep hammering it home, but it's like you're authorizing yourself to the MCP server that can talk to something else, not to those downstream servers or like the resource servers, the other APIs just yet.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important distinction, Dan, and what you're calling out. The distinction that you are calling out of, we're talking about protecting the MCP server and making sure that the clients that talk to it, the MCP clients that talk to it, are authorized to do so. And then whatever that MCP server does downstream is separate. And I think that distinction is really important to keep in mind. That may be OAuth and that may be other things, but
that's
Aaron
key. That's key. I was going to say, like, right, like it's like, it could be auth, could be API keys, could be certificates, could be like a million other things. Like, it doesn't even need to be auth at all.
Aaron. And presuming it is OAuth, like, I think, Aaron, this is another place where it's important to kind of circle back to the roles here. And like, are these roles, sort of a leading question, are these roles different in each of these circumstances? Is the MCP server playing a different role in each of these kind of different distinctions that Den was talking about?
Yeah, and again, this is another reason to call them roles rather than trying to think of them as the identity of the thing. It's playing a role, right? So this MCP server is playing the role of a resource server to the MCP client. But then that MCP server, if it's really just fronting the real Dropbox API, it is going to be playing the role of an OAuth client to the Dropbox API, right? So it's playing two roles, and and it gets really confusing to try to talk about this stuff because it starts sounding like, well, everything is everything else, and this is that, and everything's a client now, and everything's an agent, right? But that's why, like, again, let's just try to like use the terms that we have in the industry. We have a definition of OAuth roles, and they are very specific and they are very well defined. And just because something is playing one role in one scenario doesn't mean it can't play another role in another part of the flow.
And to your point also, Den, you said like it could be today, people are really excited about the scenario of an MCP server that can serve me, my data from Dropbox. That's exciting, and that's like where a lot of the interest is, because it obviously would be very useful and could build really cool stuff with it. But to your point, tomorrow it could be a service that doesn't use OAuth at all. It could be a service that uses API keys, or it could just be like, hey, I'm building an MCP server and it's like Nate's calculus tools, and it's just like math, or it's physics simulations or something, and it like has nothing to do with auth at all. It might be just running some code, or it could be like in front of a beefy supercomputer somewhere or something, in which case that role that the MCP server is playing is truly, like you said, the role of I am just exposing resources, tools, the objects that the MCP server exposes, and then what happens later, or what happens kind of downstream of that, is not the client's problem. It's not the client's concern. The MCP client, rather, like Claude or Windsurf or Cursor.
And it can be flexible, right? That's the thing. It's like people assume that MCP servers are static, but they can, or they can be dynamic. Where today I have 10 tools, tomorrow I have 100, right? Because the developers decided to learn a bunch of stuff. And for them, all we do, answering with the current specification, is can I access this server to begin with? Like that's it. Right. That's the question. That's can I access the server? What you do with that server afterwards is completely up to the developers of that MCP server.
Yeah. Question for you, Aaron. So I think a lot of people are wondering, and I was also wondering myself until you explained it really well. In this scenario where I want my MCP server to serve me stuff from Dropbox, why can't, I know it's not, technically correct, but why can't I just have that MCP server accept a Dropbox API token? Because like Dropbox is already identifying the user, and all my MCP server does is talk to Dropbox anyway. So why do I have to have all these separation of concerns? Like, can I just kind of collapse it down a little bit and say, well, we're talking to Dropbox anyway, so just use the Dropbox API token?
So, I mean, it does work, but the problem is that it's crossing the boundary of these roles in a very weird way. So Dropbox is issuing a token to what it knows about the OAuth client. And in that case, the OAuth client the role that is playing the OAuth client in that scenario is the MCP server. So Dropbox knows it's issued a token to the MCP authorization server. The authorization server then, if it were to just pass that token along to somebody else, now Dropbox doesn't really know that it's happened. It doesn't know who else has the token. Anybody who has that token can use it and appears to be the same client that it was issued to, which is kind of one of the critical flaws with OAuth bearer tokens. So with bearer tokens, it does work, because if I give you my hotel key, you can go get into my hotel room, right? A hotel key is a bearer token. It gives you access to resources. I can give it to somebody else and they can access the same resources. And that is it was one of the early criticisms of OAuth 2 when it was being developed, and rightly so, but there weren't a lot of better solutions at the time. Thankfully, there are now. So if we wanted to properly solve that problem of make it so that I can't just give you my hotel key, we need to add the concept of proof of possession. That's the industry term for it. Basically, if an authorization server is issuing a token to somebody, it's going to require that whoever they issue that token to proves that it's them when they come back to use the token. And there are a couple of standards for doing that in the OAuth world now. And if we imagine that is in place in this Dropbox example, it would mean that the token that is issued to the MCP server is not able to be used by anybody but that MCP server. And that's a good security property. Like, that's a good goal that we should all be striving for. And if it can't be used by anybody but the MCP server, then the MCP server can't give it to the OAuth client to give back to the MCP server, because then it just doesn't work, right? The cryptography doesn't work out that way. So the other aspect of it is, if a client is presenting an MCP server with an access token for Dropbox or some other backend API, that server has no way to validate the token is valid, because the token might just be a random string. And the only way to know if a random string token is valid is to try to use it. So there's no way for it to know anything about the client or the user or anything. It's really just, it's kind of just blurring the roles, all the roles together, and you end up with creating security vulnerabilities that are not entirely obvious and not certainly not something you would expect. Sorry, it was kind of a long answer.
There we go. Now I can see 2020 problems. Muting myself. As Aaron called out, I think there's that important separation of concerns that we also need to make sure that folks understand the difference between I'm authorizing myself to the MCP server, like, can I access the server, and can the server access APIs downstream of it? In the example of getting a Dropbox token, if you're not properly following kind of the separation of concerns that Aaron just described, you might end up in a scenario where it's like, can your server accidentally grant access to somebody that stole a token that happens to have one, and then all of a sudden they have the same access through your server as the proxy, right? It's probably not a good scenario. So in these cases, and that Aaron kind of alluded to it, is like, it's very important to follow standard best practices that have existed for a while. Things like your server needs to be able to validate a token, and you need to make sure that the token was actually issued for that server. Now, how that can be done could be different. Like, in terms of like JOTs, the JSON web tokens, you can have an audience claim, for example, that you can check and say like, oh, am I the audience? Nope, reject the token. But once you start using tokens from other services, that becomes a lot muddier, and you're introducing more risk into your system.
On the topic of developer experience too, and making sure it's easy to follow these best practices. Like what Aaron mentioned, this whole thing of collapsing these roles may work today. For some situations, it may continue to work just as a service with a like SQL injection vulnerability works right now. But over time, also, as Dropbox and other providers, all these APIs across our industry add things like proof of possession to their APIs. These things, if developers of MCP servers are collapsing these roles, suddenly those things will stop working. Right. And what we and the rest of the MCP community are really trying to do here is give people things that will work, for the foreseeable future, that do have these best security practices built and baked in. As well.
I love your example of the SQL injection. A service with a SQL injection does still work and does what it says for people who are using it for SQL queries. But if you start relying on the SQL injection to get a job done, you're relying on a security vulnerability that will eventually get patched. And as soon as it gets patched, then your thing stops working. Right.
Exactly. That's the missing half of my metaphor. I appreciate you adding that in. Well done.
Yeah. I can't possibly upgrade my my site to HTTPS, because then my the assumptions I made about it being in clear text won't work anymore. So it sounds like Ben and Aaron put it beautifully, that we are talking right now about, or what's in the spec right now is really solving the first hop, like between the MCP client, Claude, Windsurf, your agent code, to the server. Like, is that connection secure? Is it using best practices? Is it standardized? And then the further question of like, okay, yeah, but that's cool. My MCP server does need to go talk to Dropbox. How does that work? That's like Ben alluded to, that is kind of like not officially in the spec yet, kind of TBD. But it's a really important use case that, go ahead.
Yeah, it's not in the spec yet, but it also doesn't have to be, because if we set up these roles right, you can just do it without changing the spec. And that's, again, the beauty of doing this. So yes, it would be useful to have a guide for developers for showing them how, but it's not a spec problem. I What I mean by that is the MCP client is only responsible for getting the user to the MCP authorization server and then using the tokens that are issued by it. Like you described earlier, it's like an interface, right? And whatever happens behind that isn't relevant to the one using the interface. So then the MCP authorization server, because the user is now sitting in front of a browser at that URL because they went to go connect the tool, it can do an OAuth flow to the actual API and get the tokens it needs. It can do it to 5 APIs before sending the user back to the client. And the client will never know that any of that happened, right? If you look at what the client sees open a URL to the authorization server, the MCP authorization server. They don't see anything else until they get back this authorization code, and then they can get tokens. And everything between that first redirect and the authorization code, it can have a whole bunch of stuff happen that the client doesn't need to worry about. And that's why it's not a spec problem, because you can add that stuff in later after you've already shipped these tools according to the spec.
That's an excellent clarification.
There's helpers that could probably, it's probably worth referencing, right? Like there's specifications that talk about like using like JOT tokens as assertions to get other tokens. Like that could be helpful for developers, right? But ultimately what's also interesting about the spec that sometimes get missed in the conversation is that specs establish kind of the min bar. All service should do this to be able to interoperate.
Right.
But ultimately, you might end up in scenarios where you have MCP servers running inside enterprises that can use their own server-to-server, credentials, whatever that might be. It could be certificates, it could be other tokens, it could be API keys for all we know. So
Kerberos
we have
inside my.
Yeah, don't you say Kerberos?
Yeah,
Jen.
don't use Kerberos. Sure, fair enough. But these are the kind of things that we'll see, right? It's like that proliferation of like there's the min bar. If you want to have your MCP servers, MCP clients interop between each other, you have to follow the OAuth specification. But that doesn't stop you from doing a whole bunch of other custom stuff. We had the discussion in the PR for the current spec version, which was, well, what if my client wants to do, a whole bunch of other different things to authorize the users? Like, you can if you're building a custom client. It just so happens that this is not going to be per spec, and then you expect the servers to understand what you're doing.
I think a great example there is like referring to it as the min bar is a great way to say it, because the spec is not the totality of what you can possibly do. The spec is like, okay, if I want to do something custom in my MCP server, I can do that. But unless it's in the spec, I can't go expect that Claude is also going to understand that custom thing I did, and Cursor will also understand that custom thing I did, and so on and so forth. To Aaron's point, though, the beautiful thing about having a min bar that has these kind of flexible extension points or flexible roles is that if we agree on that interface, then my custom stuff that my server is doing, as long as it's still behind that interface, I can knock myself out. And the Cursors and Claudes and Windsurfs of the world will still work. To your point, Aaron, if I bake my custom logic behind the role of the authorization server, for example, then all the client needs to know is how to get to that authorization server and how to talk to it correctly, which is a really nice thing to think about when we talk about like the spec being like the minimum Venn diagram overlap of like all the clients, all the servers. They all need to agree on this base point, which can be like quite small actually in some cases.
So this is all great for the consumer world of this kind of like users connecting their accounts individually. But we've mentioned the enterprise use cases a couple of times, and there is something that I want to point out here that does actually require the clients to do a slightly different version of an OAuth spec that would really help things out a lot. Let me just paint the user experience picture here. Imagine that I log into an AI agent client through my enterprise account. I've downloaded Claude, I click login, and it does go through my SSO to even get me access to the interface. At that point, I've already tied this to the enterprise IDP, right? The next thing
you've logged into Claude with your Okta credentials or with your Keycloak SSO or whatever the case may be.
Exactly. So my corporate account that I use to log into email and payroll and whatever, I've now also used it to log into Claude. And then what does Claude need to do next? Well, it wants to go and give me access to tools to a bunch of other corporate resources, which I also log into SSO, right? So currently, the user experience would be log into Claude, and then I click the button that says connect Google Drive, connect Gmail, connect Dropbox, connect every app that I use in the company SSO, and each of those does a redirect out to the company SSO before coming back. And it all works, But the user experience is a bit rough of having to one by one click through all of these, right? And there's a lot of consent screens, there's a lot of login, there's probably a lot of touch IDs popping up all over the place. Wouldn't it be nice if I just logged into Claude and it already had access to all of the resources that I as an employee have access to? That would be magic, right?
What is this spec that you're pitching to us, Aaron?
Well, I want to also I want to also paint another more of the background here. Like, a naive solution might be, okay, the enterprise, my company, builds an MCP server or forks an MCP server that connects it to GitHub and connects it to Azure and connects it to Gmail and whatever it's going to do. And that MCP server has some like admin credential baked into it, which, maybe like a OAuth client credential flow and its OAuth tokens, and they're short-lived, and that's cool. But like at the fundamental, there's like an admin thing that accesses all the data, and maybe that MCP server does some translation on its own to know it's me, and it'll only read my email and not read your email, Aaron, and stuff like that. But now the MCP server is getting really complicated, and it needs to worry a lot about auth and users. And
the authorization problem there is extremely complex, and you're kind of, again, describing a lot of the motivations for creating OAuth in the first place, of the software being able to act on behalf of a user, right? Because then you get a lot cleaner separation of the authorization questions become a lot easier when you have that.
Mm-hmm. So so what do we do?
So this is something I've been working on in the OAuth working group for a couple of years. There's a draft spec in progress, in flight in the working group. You would not necessarily read that spec and immediately understand that it applies to this scenario, which is the fun part of spec writing, because it can actually apply to a lot of different scenarios as well. But it does apply to this exact scenario. So we'll make sure that the show notes have links to all that, because the names you're never going to remember anyway. But essentially, it's exactly this. It allows that first application that you logged into to exchange the tokens it got, the ID token, or even it could be a SAML assertion, but let's stick with ID tokens, please, for a credential that it can go and use at these other applications like Dropbox, GitHub, Zoom, whatever. And that was bad timing.
We still see you, but you blipped out for a second.
Switch cameras.
Yeah, my camera reset.
It's okay, it happens.
Well,
That's how we know this was recorded live.
Let's make sure I'm on. Can you still hear me okay? Okay. Well, we're almost at the end of this, so I won't bother trying to fix it. So, where was I?
Maybe start over. So what spec, or how do we get this magic?
Yeah, so this magic is an in-progress spec at the OAuth working group right now, which you wouldn't necessarily know applies to the scenario, because the spec language has to cover a lot of other scenarios it can also apply to. So no worries if you haven't stumbled across it yet. It's also still in progress. It's not a final RFC yet. I'll make sure that we get the show notes to link to it, because the name's kind of a mouthful anyway. But it's exactly this. It allows an application that you first log into to then exchange the token that it got during that login stage for tokens that it can use to get access tokens from applications like Zoom or Slack or Dropbox or whatever that it's trying to ultimately get access to. So I'm excited for this. I've been working on prototypes of this. We've got some open source code demoing it as well. And I'm really excited to play around with it some more.
What is for anyone curious, what is the technical term for it?
The name of the spec is the Identity Assertion Authorization Grant. So identity assertion meaning it's the thing that the application used to know who the user was in the first place, and then using that as proof of authorization to grant access to other APIs. So identity assertion authorization grant.
For enterprise customers, that's going to be extremely valuable, because one of the top annoyances that folks have is constant authentication prompts. Yep. Just like, log in. It's like, I gave you my credentials. Why are you asking me? Like 15 different times. So this smooths out that path so much.
It smooths out the user experience, and then it also provides the enterprise admin with the ability to control it, of decide which apps are allowed to talk to each other. Because right now, it's actually kind of a huge security hole in the enterprise world of you have end users, employees, who are saying, yes, Slack can connect to Google Drive. And the enterprise admin doesn't have any visibility into that, because that's happening between those two applications directly. And if we put this into the AI world, now we've got end users, employees who are allowing these applications to talk to each other essentially behind the back of anybody who's controlling the information in the enterprise. So if we can adopt this identity assertion authorization grant, it moves that control of which apps can talk to which and the visibility of it all up to the enterprise admin, where they can then see it, monitor it, turn it on, turn it off, choose which groups of users can do it, choose which apps can talk to each other, and it'll be a lot better.
Well, thank you everyone for a fantastic discussion. We went way longer than I expected, but it was awesome to kind of dig into the details here and understand what's going on with MCP auth. Where should people find you if they want to ask questions or continue the conversation? Do you have like socials that you want to plug or blogs that you'd like to link to?
Yeah.
You want to go first?
Yeah, sure. You can find me on LinkedIn, Aaron Parecki, also my blog, aaronpk.com.
I myself can be found I'm also a fan of the .dev domain, so I'm on den.dev. And all the links are there in the header, so just go there.
I'm on LinkedIn and X, Nate Barbettini or N Barbettini. Also on GitHub under that handle.
And I'm also LinkedIn, GitHub, W Dawson for me. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, folks.
All right.
Thanks. It's been fun.